Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Saskia Otto. I am a senior researcher here at the Fabian Society, and I am delighted to welcome you to this session on business and growth. An incredibly important topic. Labour has been clear that our plans for renewal rely on growth, from public services to net zero. But it's a big ask, because while other countries have recovered from the pandemic and are growing, the UK looks at recession. So we're looking at some very, very important questions for today, and who better to talk about this than Jonathan Reynolds, the Shadow Business Secretary, who has just returned from Davos. So I'll hand over to Jonathan to speak for 10 minutes before going on to the other panelists.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. How are you all feeling? It's a long conference. Let's have some audience participation to start off with. How are we feeling? Yeah, right. Fantastic. Look, thank you to the Fabians for the invitation today. I'm obviously extremely proud to be the Shadow Secretary of State for Business and Trade, and I'm also very proud of the relationship that we've built with business over the last few years. I think it is a visible sign of how the Labour Party has changed since 2019, and it's also a visible sign of our credibility on the economy. It's great to be doing this session today, Saskia, with all of you in the panel as well. What I want to say in these opening remarks is just why getting the economy growing more strongly is so integral to Labour's plans. I want to say why I need you, we need you as Fabian supporters and people on the left to support us in that argument. And I also want to talk about some of the decisions that we will face, especially on decarbonisation, which are, I think, as much political as well as economic decisions, but are integral to getting this mission right. And I'll explain that point with specific reference to the situation with the steelworks in Port Talbot, which is obviously hugely important to all of us. Now, to state the obvious, a huge difference between 2024 as an election year and 1997 is the state of the economy. Because in 1997, growth was actually quite strong when we took over. The country was a mess, public services were awful, but we could make a political decision to use the proceeds of that growth to address that. Now that isn't where we are today. And if we do win an election, our economic inheritance looks very difficult. Because on growth and productivity and wages, these have quite frankly been awful years. And the UK has, I believe, a toxic combination of stalled productivity and high inequality. And that has been sharply exacerbated in recent times by rising food prices, rising energy bills, and higher housing costs. And turning that around in itself is a huge challenge. But we've got to do it at the same time as delivering a transition to net zero, which has no peacetime parallel. We've got to fix a Brexit deal that has had significant consequences for the UK. We've got to respond to this incredible shift in global competitiveness through things like President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. And I believe we've also got to address the UK's pronounced regional inequality and an aging population, and maybe, depending on the outcome of the US presidential election, a world where we couldn't take for granted things like the US security guarantee for Europe. So that is a big set of challenges. And of course, it's always important to recognize in the face of that, we do already have some amazing things in the UK. We have some brilliant sectors, we have some brilliant firms, we have some brilliant people. We have strengths in professional and financial services, aerospace, automotive, AI, quantum, and more. But if you want to be this country's business secretary, and I would like to be this country's business secretary, I don't think you can be complacent. And you can't think the job is just turning up to visit that good stuff and having your photo taken in a high-vis jacket. And that is why Keir's first mission, and a huge amount of his personal focus, has been on these challenges. We want the highest sustained growth in the G7. That is incredibly ambitious. And the Tories have tried to respond to that by saying, actually, they think they're doing quite well already, right? I mean, who are they kidding in that argument? The simple fact is on wage growth, productivity, GDP per capita, there has been a serious decline in the dynamism of the UK in the last 14 years. And during their time in office, the Tories have managed, on average, to grow the economy at about 1.4% a year. To give you a comparison between 1980 and 2008, that would consistently have been above 2.5%. Now, I know, I've written in my notes here, I know some people think these figures are pretty dry. Let's be honest, they are pretty dry, okay? And I understand that. So we've got to put that argument in human family terms. Because an economy that grows at 2.5% is basically doubling in size every 28 years because of compounding. If you grow at 1.5%, it's 46 years. If you grow at 1%, it's doubling every 70 years. So in human terms, it means this. This is my story. My granddad left school at 14. He was a coal miner. I know there's some people here in the northeast of England as well who'll be familiar with that story. And we love, don't we? We love nostalgic family stories about things like coal mining in Labour. But he did 51 years down the same mine. And then his son, my dad, was a firefighter. And these are vital and important jobs of which I am incredibly proud. But if you were told, either my dad or my granddad, that just a generation later, I'd be here, I'd be talking to you in this place at a conference like this, I'd be just coming back from Davos, they wouldn't frankly have believed that, okay? But they've been able to see that happen because the people who came before us in the Fabian Society and the Labour Party, probably at January conferences like this, in 1945 and in 1964 and in 1997, they could use that growth and prosperity to do things like raise the school leaving age, to extend higher education, to build an NHS. And that, in turn, unleashed a further wave of talent and prosperity that many of us in this room today will recognize we are the direct beneficiaries of. And the truth is, friends, today for many people that has broken down in Britain. Okay? We've got the first generation of British young people who in several cases will be less well off than their parents. You may have seen something I think is a shocking story just a few weeks ago, that now the most common living arrangement for young adults in Britain today, for 18 to 34-year-olds, is living with their parents. Right? And that is what we have got to change before we can fundamentally tackle anything else. So when people say to me, you know, this focus on growth, what does that really mean for people? Look, it means everything. And fixing that, frankly, is what I think about pretty much every second of every day, right? This is the Labour agenda, and there is not one quick fix or single answer. To start with, we've got to do the simple things better. I often say we may have a lot of difficult, complex economic problems, but you have to wonder where we'd be if we started by building enough homes and having a transport system you could get reliably around the north of England on. And the same is true of other essential infrastructure. You know, Cambridge is, for instance, an example of a bit of the UK economy which is dynamic, it's innovative. It's got huge amounts of public and private investment. It's led by world-class higher education. Do you know what holds it back? A lack of water. Right? There's not enough water to build enough homes in Cambridge. And what it takes to fix those things is political capital. It means saying and meaning that when we say we'll get Britain building again, we are going to deliver the planning changes and the political will to make that happen. And we will. But of course, we also need a bit more than that. Britain suffers badly from low levels of public and private investment. We actually have the lowest business investment in the G7. And we have to change that. And at the heart of our proposals are our plans for a modern industrial strategy. It's an offer to work with business, to drive up business investment and provide the stable framework that has been so lacking for 14 years. Then there's our Green Prosperity Plan, which we're very much committed to, investing public money to leverage in much greater sums of private investment to deliver the battery factories, the green steel, the warm homes we so badly need. And of course, we want to define that by what it will deliver, not what necessarily we want to spend on it, but the ambition is integral. And our New Deal for Working People is a policy aimed at greater security in the workplace, but it's also an economic policy. And the same is true of our reforms to the apprenticeship levy, giving businesses more flexibility and increasing skills investment. There's our commitment to replace business rates with a system that no longer deters investment. And of course, making Brexit work through tangible, trade-based improvements, not refighting the old battles, but delivering a veterinary agreement, touring rights for the creative industries, and a mutual recognition of qualifications for our brilliant service industries. And we need to be evangelists for new technology, for new ways of doing things. You know, the problem with automation isn't that we'll have too many robots taking away jobs. It's actually the opposite. It's that we'll have far too few robots as we currently do, especially in industry, and that makes it impossible for us to compete and succeed for the long term. And we should also be incredibly excited about AI and what new technology could do for us on problems like productivity to contribute to solving these long-lasting issues. So the comprehensive agenda we're putting forward, I believe, is integral to a faster growing economy, to better living standards, and the revenue necessary to fix public services. But actually, it's even more than that. And this is a point about the huge transition upon us, especially when it comes to decarbonisation. Now, I would argue, in British history, we historically haven't handled these moments all too well. I think the deindustrialisations of the 1980s and 1990s have left scars on Britain that you can still see today. And I fear the Tories understand none of this. And the proof of that is what we're seeing right now in Port Talbot, where the government is going to spend £500 million to make 3,000 people redundant, right? That's a bad deal. I think it's pretty obviously a bad deal. We want green steel. We've earmarked £3 billion for the steel industry in the UK to deliver it. But look, getting the transition right is the most important thing. To state the obvious, you can decarbonise anything by shutting it down. And if people in the UK came to see decarbonisation as being about deindustrialisation, with those emissions not reduced but simply outsourced to other countries, I think, frankly, that would be a disaster. And that is the big politics of achieving net zero. It's not imaginary meat taxes or Rishi's imaginary 7 bins. It's whether we make this a story of good jobs, good wages, strong communities and new opportunities, or a story about stagnation and decline and job losses and the increasing polarisation of the country. And I think that is what the Democrats in the US understand. That's the real significance of the Inflation Reduction Act and the response to Trump and populism. And it will inevitably be a big part of the politics of every developed country in the years to come. But to conclude, I know that everyone believes their own policy area is the most important, but mine really is the most important. And I believe nothing we want to do, if we get a Labour government, can be delivered without this agenda succeeding. And we should also be, because of that agenda, optimistic. Because yes, the challenges are significant, but other Labour governments have faced some pressures too, and they have all succeeded. And what excites me is the kind of economy that we could deliver, based on secure, well-paid work in an age of clean and secure energy. That isn't just the answer to the problems of the last 14 years. It could be the answer to some of the economic problems the UK has struggled with for decades. So we have this incredible opportunity, but it's not going to last forever. And the Tories winning the next election wouldn't just mean we have to wait longer to realise that. It would likely mean we lose the chance to do some of this forever, because other countries are not going to wait whilst we delay. So my final ask of you, as Fabians and friends and supporters, is to do what I think the Fabian Society has always done best for Labour governments, to be our advocates, our inspiration, to fight for ideas as well as actions, and to light the way forward to the solutions we need to that future which I think we all deserve. Thank you very much for the chance to talk to you today.
Thank you, Jonathan. And that's such an important point, is that other countries are not going to wait for us. So it's really critical that we win, and then we get this agenda right. Labour has been clear that business is going to be a key partner in delivering this agenda, and so I'm absolutely delighted to welcome 2 different people from industry with very different backgrounds and hats on to contribute to this discussion. On the right over there, we have Michael Itzer, who's the Chief Executive of ICAEW, and on my left, we have Davina Paul, who is the Chief Financial Officer of Zumo, which is a financial services startup that provides e-wallets for cryptocurrency. And Davina has more than a decade's experience in helping startups get off the ground. So very much looking forward to them contributing their expertise. I'm going to ask each of them to speak for a few minutes before turning to the audience for questions. And I'm going to start with Michael.
Thank you, Saskia, and good afternoon, everybody. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with the ICAEW, we're a professional accountancy body based about 800 metres away from here. We have 170,000 members, and they work across all parts of the economy. Our 11,500 firms, going from the very biggest, which you'll be familiar with, down to every high street, advise in excess of 3 million businesses in the UK. They employ 330,000 people. They contribute £87 billion to the UK economy and £4 billion in exports. The ICAEW's vision is that our members help enable a world of sustainable economies, which I think aligns very much with what you heard from Johnny in his opening address. We believe very much that the biggest challenge facing business in the next few decades is going to be transitioning the economy to net zero. But that has to take place in a manner which is just for all, and importantly, it needs to be nature positive. There is no point transitioning to net zero if we destroy the planet on which we live. We survey our members across business on a quarterly basis. Our next survey will be coming out at the end of January. And while there is some stability at the moment in the business community, it's not easy at all. And the outlook going forward for 2024 is it's going to be difficult. The global insecurity that you heard from David Lammy in the address immediately preceding this impacts business every day, and business craves stability. They crave the ability to be able to plan without major shocks and interruptions. They crave a government that's got a plan. And it's so important that for the UK, for the years ahead, we have an industrial strategy. Personally, I don't think this is ideological. I just think this is good sense. But some people think it is ideological. We very much welcome Johnny's remarks about growth and the importance of growth to enable a government to fulfill its agenda. The UK has got a strong entrepreneurial culture, but right now it's not always easy to get a business off the ground. It's relatively straightforward to form a company, but have you tried to get a VAT registration? Have you tried to open a bank account? Have you tried to employ your first employee? These things are really difficult. If you look at some of the other countries around the world who support business, you can do this in 2 or 3 clicks. A VAT registration at the moment in the UK can take months. These are problems that can be solved. They're not intractable. Yesterday, I had a meeting with some colleagues talking about AI and the impact that it's going to have on the accountancy profession. We had demonstrations of 21 co-pilots, and they are so exciting in terms of what they promise and present for the future. But the second question I asked is, what about all the people who are employed in these areas? What is going to happen to them? And the question is, well, the answer to that question is that people haven't thought that through yet. And I think the next government needs to address this pretty quickly, because technology and the opportunities it presents are fantastic, but we need to think about what happens to all the employees today. I was at COP28 in Dubai last month, and it was quite a positive conference. I mean, don't believe some of the negativity you heard. There is so much innovation going on. There is so much promise and excitement, but there isn't enough of that happening in the UK. And we have got to be at the very front of the agenda for the transition to net zero. We've lost our way in the last couple of years, and we've got to regain that going forward. So Saskia, those are my opening remarks, and look forward to the questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I think that sort of point on just transition is incredibly important. I'm now going to hand over to Davina to talk about her experiences.
Great, thank you, Saskia, and it's really great to be here. So, as Saskia mentioned, I'm Chief Financial Officer and Deputy CEO of Zumo. Zumo is a digital asset wallet. We're FCA registered, and we are headquartered in Leith, up in Edinburgh. I'm also a co-founder of an angel investment syndicate called Galvanise Capital. So I'm not here as a politician or a policymaker. I'm here as someone who has spent the last 15 plus years in the SME trenches, building, growing, scaling, selling and investing in UK technology businesses. And I think, as Michael mentioned, we have this really rich history of entrepreneurship and invention. And that's shown, right? We are the European leaders when it comes to unicorns. Most of those unicorns are tech companies. But it isn't just about the billion-dollar businesses. SMEs, so small and medium enterprises, are the lifeblood of our economy. SMEs account for 60% of employment in the UK. That's nearly 17 million jobs. But as a founder, as an entrepreneur, the UK is more and more starting to feel like the place that you may not want to start your business in. And Michael mentioned some of the reasons for that, but things like entrepreneurs' relief being capped, particularly if you're talking about businesses that are high growth potential, they're in knowledge-rich areas, and in some of these emerging technologies like AI and climate tech. Entrepreneurs' relief has been capped. R&D, so research and development tax credits, have been cut, chopped, changed. To be honest, I don't know where we're at with that, and I'm sure the accountants have it sewn up, but business really is finding it difficult to find out where we are. Obviously, the B word is still having ramifications for business as well, and I'm sure a lot of businesses can tell you that. And then we do have a skill shortage in this country, especially for the high knowledge roles. Companies like mine up and down the country are going to offshore solutions in terms of filling some of those really high knowledge roles like development and engineering, and that has further ramifications on our R&D eligibility. But business in the UK does have the knowledge and the skills to train and create jobs. And there are brilliant pockets of this happening up and down the UK. For example, the work that Cadent Gas is doing in the Midlands and the Northwest in terms of retrofit, training people for retrofitting. If I look at the example of Zumo, in 2021, we were able to use the government Kickstart scheme to hire 8 people, 6 of whom we retained after the funding. So there's pockets of this happening, but how do we make this scalable? And really, the only way to make this scalable is by business partnering with government. But often we either don't know who to talk to, where to go, or we just don't have the resource to do it by ourselves. So I think there's really innovative ways that we can incentivize business to help us scale, to help us create jobs, create talent, and grow the economy, because that is what's going to unlock our economy. I'd also say there is probably, and it may be misplaced, but a perception of fear of business and fear of technology. What I would say is, please lean into business. I think anybody who was at the Labour conference last year saw how engaged business are. We want to take you on that journey. If there are knowledge gaps, we can bridge those gaps, because we believe that Business and technology will be the drivers to growth of our economy in the years to come, and the way that's going to succeed is by business and government partnering together.
Thank you, Davina, and I can see there's a huge amount of enthusiasm in the room for that message of partnering with business. I'm going to come to questions in a second. I just have one of my own to kick things off. I think on the question of partnering with business, I'm very interested to hear from Jonathan and the other panelists as well on, we know that, kind of delivering Labour's growth objectives can't happen without business. We also know that sometimes the best of intentions don't always translate into good outcomes for citizens, for workers, for the environment. And I'm interested to hear from the panelists on how you think Labour can strike that balance between being a friend with business while also making sure that business fulfills its social purpose. I'll start with Jonathan.
Yeah, no, that's the absolute heart of it all, really. I mean, look, we do believe, and I do say when I'm out there doing the job, that, the new strength of the relationship between Labour and business is not just about politics or elections or positioning. It's a genuine belief that that partnership is necessary for good government and good policy. But obviously, that in no way, I say, diminishes from what we want that relationship to deliver, which is, we've got a clear commitment to actually the biggest and most expansive improvements in employment rights any government, any Labour government, any government at all has ever put forward, right? We have got clear ambitions that we believe over time, working again in partnership, the minimum wage should be a real living wage. I know the Tories call it a living wage, right? But we all know what it is. So we've got that at the heart of it. Now, this is the crucial bit though, right? And this is essentially the first shadow cabinet meeting after the reshuffle where I became the business secretary. I did the presentation and this is what I said. If you believe in that, right, if you think that is necessary, as I think many of us in this room certainly do, if you ever need to call a business out or you want to critique something which you think is happening, which needs to change or is wrong, you are more able to do that. People take you more seriously if that is built on a genuine belief that in the main, you want to work positively together. If people look at you as a politician and say, well, of course Reynolds is saying that, he's never got a good thing to say about any business, that's going to get you nowhere. The strength of, so I say our relationship with business in the Labour Party doesn't prevent any of that. Actually, it makes it possible. And of course, there are times where we've had to be very, very strong. I mean, what happened with the hire and rehire, or actually fire and just fire scandal on the ferries, from DP World was absolutely unacceptable. So I think, because I anticipate that question sometimes in party events, I'm absolutely happy to take it. This is about, yes, delivering our agenda, but no one should believe anything other than it is an advance of a stronger economy, better living standards, and all the things that we would want that economy to deliver for people.
That's great, thank you. I would like to ask some of the industry folks to comment on that. Davina, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I think, in the last few years in business, there's been a huge ESG agenda. And of course, there have been accusations of greenwashing and social washing. But actually, what that focus has done is implemented some really good working practices. And there's really great examples of this, especially in terms of, employee well-being and kind of training and opportunities. So I think there are those examples of best practices. How do we highlight that? Again, when it's happening in pockets, it's, the importance there is to make it scalable and really shout about those great examples and kind of join the dots. I think also, there is a lot of work happening and a lot of research happening in social value. I know the University of Liverpool has been working on this, and I think the government's figure is £3 for every pound spent on social value return, and they've calculated it could be over £5. So there's so much great data there for us to be really pushing the needle on this, and I think there's a lot of work to do, Jonathan.
Great, thank you, Davina. I just want to go into Michael, and before we coming back to Jonathan for a final thoughts on this.
So just a couple of thoughts on it. I mean, first of all, I think the agenda of business and the agenda of a potential next Labour government don't have to be in conflict. I think what business and a Labour government might want will be surprisingly common. There might be a few areas where they diverge, but broadly speaking, I think to look for conflict would be completely wrong and misplaced in the world that we're in today. We know that for a Labour government to succeed, they need revenues, and those revenues are going to come from an economy that does well and businesses that pay tax. The two things go hand in hand. And when we talk about jobs, how often have you heard a CEO stand up and say, the most important asset of this company are our people? And I think good companies get that. Now, there are some companies who don't, but I think that that's not something where we should see divisions between capital and labour. They both want the same thing.
I'll just add one more thing to that, which is that I think both Michael and Davina said very well. You know, one under-analysed thing is that the generation of business leaders today, I think, do have a set of objectives, a set of priorities that are very much in alignment with much of what we want to do. And of course, I would also say, whilst we've changed in Labour, the Conservative Party has changed as well. And what the Conservative Party has changed into, I think, is, for many people in business, more of a concern.
Thank you. Right, so I'm going to turn to the audience for questions. I always say, please keep them brief and make sure that there's a question mark at the end. I'm going to start with the lady in the soft pink jacket at the front.
So Rishi Sunak has said that more people should be prepared to fail when they start a business. Obviously, Labour wants people to be able to succeed if they start a business. So what will Labour do to make sure that they can succeed from the beginning? And what will they do about unfair business practices which are rife in some industries?
Thank you, and I'll take two more. Gentleman in the blue shirt, jumper over there.
John Smith, quite a famous name in Labour's history, of course. I'm a member of the Beaconsfield Labour Party, which is not a particularly productive area for getting MPs into Parliament. So I've been told to go and canvass in Wickham for Emma Reynolds, who is trying to remove Steve Baker. I'm sure we're going to do that. My question is, Labour has been confronted by the whole issue of productivity and growth so many times when it's come to power. Harold Wilson came to power saying we're going to have a national plan which will result in growth in the economy. Unfortunately, that didn't bode well, and in the end ended in relative failure. My question is, beyond the target of having the highest growth rate in the G7, is there a plan as to how we're going to do it? Does that plan have any targets in terms of when we will become the highest growth country in the G7? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I shall go on to that person in the maroon jumper over there. At the, you're looking behind you, but I'm pointing towards you. There we go.
I wanted to ask a slightly narrower question, given we're in the city. And it was useful for it to be pointed out that, yes, Britain is still very good at producing unicorns, but lots of those unicorns then fail to make the step up to being large businesses. And indeed, increasingly often, many of them aren't IPOing at the London Stock Exchange. Many of them are going abroad to New York or into Europe. And it seems that more than ever, the London Stock Exchange is not a particularly attractive place for high-growth businesses. So my question is, what needs to change both in the city and in British capital markets more generally to make this an attractive place for businesses from abroad, to retain our highest growth businesses, and to give the firms access to the masses of capital they need to properly transition and to provide good jobs?
Thank you. Those are all really great questions. So the three questions are, Labour is promising growth. How are we different? What are our targets and how are we going to achieve it? Rather than being prepared to fail, how can we support businesses to succeed from the outset? And then also, how can we help businesses scale through kind of better access to capital, etc. Does anyone have any preference for one of those that you want to answer? Johnny, Jonathan?
I'll do them all.
Right.
I never dodge a question.
Go for it.
The third one. Yeah.
The third one, all right.
Do you want to go first? I'll just say it's a bit of a hostage to fortune, so you never dodge a question before you hear all the full rounds, isn't it? But there we go. Liz, look, I mean, first of all, when someone like Rishi says, people should be prepared to fail, I always think, and perhaps a few people in the audience think similar to this, it's one thing to be prepared to fail if you've got this kind of cushion of incredible wealth to fall back on and there's no consequences for you and your family. If you're a person who has to succeed because there'd be no plan B, it's a different proposition, isn't it? But you're right to mention unfair business practice. I know it's something you've been working on yourself for some time. Look, I think there is a particular issue that we have various, codes of practice and bodies for certain sectors, but I think enforcement is an issue. I think like much of the decline in enforcement capacity that's come through things like the austerity in local government, there are some real issues there, and there are not easy or obvious solutions to it, but I think good government in this space, good business policy isn't just about the platform of policies to succeed, it is how those are enforced, and the level playing field is in there. I also think, on our New Deal for working people, sometimes cited as, is this going to be a place where the relationship with business is a little bit harder? Look, first of all, I think those aspirations that we've got are absolutely right. But I also say to people, if you think about the gig economy, what you want is a level playing field, right? And at the minute, there isn't a level playing field in some areas. There are some gig economy businesses that do pay, holidays, pensions, sick pay, and they're competing against businesses who don't. So you want the level playing field there. There are businesses where the workforce is genuinely self-employed under any test, but because that's a common law test, you have a situation where you might want to do more for your employees, but you can't because you trigger a test of legal control. So there's a whole range of things which I think, in terms of those practices, how business operates, we can get better, and that's what we are committed to. John Smith, fabulous name. So there's no no-go areas for Labour, though I appreciate if you don't turn us in a Labour MP in Beaconsfield, well, we won't accuse you of letting us down, but Emma Reynolds is a tremendous colleague and would be delighted. We're not related, by the way, we sometimes get that. Emma will be brilliant back in Parliament, and the fact that campaign is so strong is, again, a testimony of how strong we are across the country. We won't talk for too long about Harold Wilson's national plan, though I'm a big fan of Labour history. Putting George Brown in charge of it was probably not the way to make it succeed, if I'm being totally honest. But look, the pitch, John, is the aggregate of all the policies and more what I mentioned. Industrial policy, the Green Prosperity Plan, planning reform, changes to the grid, the apprenticeship levy, making Brexit work. As I say, there's never going to be a kind of just do this and it's all fine. Our problems are bigger than that. It's each of those produces a gain that in total, I think, does something hopefully quite dramatic about that. And look, I know that the argument we sometimes get on the highest growth in the G7 is it's obviously a relative target. Look, I think when you identify a problem and you're making a political argument that it must be better, you can either have a dry statistical target. I mean, you might remember Liz Truss had a target. You might remember Liz Truss, full stop, to be honest. She had a target of 2.5%. What does that mean to people? I think that relative position of where we are is a better way to do it. And an excellent question on the city, which Michael, you might want to, and Davina might want to answer in more detail. But look, it's a huge issue. It comes up all the time. Every business meeting I have will be referenced this in some way. I think the particular worry is around certain sectors where we're obviously a great place for tech companies, but they're not choosing at the minute to list in London. And I think the perception that our stock market is reflective of maybe the economy of a few years ago rather than contemporary is a real challenge. We've tried to be constructive around this. We broadly welcomed the Edinburgh reforms and what was in the Financial Services and Markets Bill and tried to build that up. I think there is more to do. If you're coming to Labour's business conference on the 1st of February, which will be a great event, we're launching our Financial Services review paper report at that. So there's a little bit more in there, but I'll let the rest of the panel respond to those.
Thank you. Michael, did you want to come in on the scaling question?
Yes, so the challenges of the London Stock Exchange have been commented on by many people. And there are some who think the solution to attracting businesses to London to float is to deregulate and make it as easy as possible to list and have a minimum of compliance. But when they do that, there is a flaw in the argument, because most of those businesses at the moment are choosing to list in the United States. And for those of you who have or do work in the city, you will know that in the United States, the oversight of the SEC is very, very tight and very, very heavy. So it's not a regulation issue. The reason why people go to the United States is because the United States has deep pools of capital. And those deep pools of capital allow businesses to get a higher multiple. So how can we solve that in the UK, and why do we have a problem at the moment? Brexit. London was the European centre of finance. That gave us the ability to actually play on the world stage with competing, frankly, with the Hong Kongs, the Singapores, and the New York. What we need to do to get that back is have a better trading relationship with our European neighbours going forward and make sure that London once again becomes the financial capital of Europe.
Thank you. Davina, did you want to come in on that with your investor experience?
So I echo a lot of what Michael said, I think, and it's worth pointing out at that earlier stage, I think the UK is brilliant, and you've got loads of, grant incentives, UKRI, a brilliant resource for early stage businesses. But just to point back to something that Michael mentioned earlier, it's instability as well. I think that's another reason that businesses are turning away from the UK. And sometimes it feels like the Conservative Party talk a great game, especially when it comes to emerging technologies. Who can remember the very cringeworthy unicorn kingdom that kind of made hashtag entrepreneur life really uncool overnight? The issue with that is, and they're very receptive to my world, the crypto world, but a lot of that is very surface. And I think this is where that kind of deep knowledge and expertise on technologies, on AI, on blockchain, which, I know people are very nervous about, but can have really fundamental applications to things like government procurement processes and can really change the game there. If the Labour Party are able to get that deeper understanding of technology to really drive policy properly, I think that will negate some of that instability. And I think, that instability is one of the biggest drivers, I would say.
That's an interesting point, Davina. Thank you. I wonder if Jonathan had a reflection on that kind of how the Labour Party is doing with technology and whether there is more we can do to kind of embrace the future, or should we kind of go the Rishi Sunak way, or what is the sort of Labour way and approach to tech?
It's a great question. I don't really want to emulate Rishi Sunak on too many things, but I think the first thing to say is, look, the point around the UK, as Davina made about the UK's role in the early stage and how some of that ecosystem works, which to me is fundamentally based on talent, is a really good point. I mean, the one thing you do hear whenever you go anywhere around the world is the respect, for instance, that British higher education is held in, our universities. I cannot remember the last time I heard a Conservative cabinet minister say anything positive about Britain's universities. So you've got to celebrate the good bits that you have around that. On the wider attitude to technology, look, obviously, because the Prime Minister has split the previous Business and Industrial Strategy Department into several bits. You've now got this new Department of Science, which my colleague Peter Kyle heads up. And Peter's approach for us here would be just, relentlessly positive about the opportunities. Of course, there are regulatory issues and, risks like any sector. Good regulation will make it a more successful story. But in terms of how government can deliver services and how we can be the platform and build on the good things that we've got, yes, Peter would want that to be fundamentally a message of positivity and how we can continue to build on those strengths as part of a wider economic policy.
Thank you. Let's take 3 more questions. I am going to ask that woman in the red jumper at the back first. I'm going to ask other women to please put their hands up if you have a question. Oh, we have another one at the front here. And that gentleman with the colourful shirt.
Rachel Bergin. Section 172 of the Companies Act says that directors have to act in the interests of their shareholders and give consideration to other stakeholders, such as their employees and suppliers and customers. Do you think this section should be rewritten? And do you think that there should be increases in enforcement of compliance to it?
Thank you, Rachel.
Hi, Alexandra Sufit. I wanted to talk about how we create fairer workplaces, because obviously to unlock growth and innovation, one of those routes is diversity of thought in the room. You don't get fresh ideas coming from echo chambers. If you look at, for example, the gender pay gap, it's barely moved since we've had mandatory gender pay gap reporting. I mean, 1% is hardly anything to cry home about. And now we are lobbying again for ethnicity pay gap reporting, but I fear that's not going to give us the answer we want either. Does Labour have any bold, bright ideas as to how we can really, truly solve the issue of fairness in the workplace once and for all in my lifetime? That would be my question. Thank you.
It's a big one. That gentleman over there.
Thank you. Andy from Swansea in the colourful shirt. I think around about 3 million of the small businesses, and we talked about the scale of the small business in the business economy, are actually sole traders. I think it's about 3.1 billion. And they're freelancers or even kitchen table businesses of one sort or another. And whilst they are probably below the VAT threshold, they do represent an important part of the business economy. I looked through the Green Paper on New Deal, Johnny, and I couldn't see any specific reference to micro businesses. So an example would be if you sell through Etsy, Etsy hang on to the money for 90 days before you can you see, that's after the commission, of course. So is there any specific thinking of what can be done to make things a little fairer and easier for that small business community? And then if John goes last, could you tell us the likelihood of any of this making its way to the manifesto?
Good.
Thank you. Those are fantastic questions. So we've got the question of shareholder primacy, good work, and how do we support micro businesses? Jonathan, did you want to take those as well?
I will, and I'll try not to speak for too long because they're all so good. But great question from Rachel to start with on sort of directors' duties and corporate governance. And look, I think there is definitely a debate that needs to be had about whether the current kind of Corporate Governance Companies Act regime in the UK gives business leaders, first of all, the range of tools that they need to run the businesses how they want, Rachel. And I think also, there is a persistent question in the UK about kind of short-termism versus long-termism and the need to address that balance a bit more to long-term value creation and all the positive bits that comes with. I think you also very skillfully mentioned enforcement. Look, I think where we've seen in the past, this is how I think about this, really egregious examples of behaviour that no one in business would want. Your Philip Greens and people like that. I would say by any definition, they breach that duty in the Companies Act as it stands, but there is no enforcement of that. So I think the danger if you're a shadow business secretary is you don't want to promote things that are tokenistic, that actually wouldn't make the difference, that actually, identify the problem but aren't really the solution. But I am looking, and we are as a team looking at kind of how we could provide people with the tools they themselves are asking for and how we can improve that culture overall. I'm aware, of course, and in touch with people like the Better Business Act campaign, who I think are doing a really good job bringing business people and campaigners together on a shared mission. But again, what I would want is that as a broad package of reforms, proposals that we can consult with in the proper way that would kind of be a meaningful contribution to that rather than just trying to change a few words and thinking that would do it, because I think we all recognise that wouldn't be the case. Another great question on fair workplaces. Look, I think I probably can't guarantee that fundamentally a Labour government will solve this problem once and for all, but I think there are important things in this direction. Some of that is around reporting and accountability, and obviously Annalisa leads the equalities brief in the Shadow Cabinet around there. The sort of caveat I would put on that is, to get reporting right, you've got to really, again, have that partnership to make sure it's getting you the information that you need. So, I remember, I think, around about the time of the last Labour manifesto, we had a big conversation about in the manifesto around kind of multiples of pay between senior management and the shop floor. Now, of course, if you did that, a business in the city like Goldman Sachs would look quite good, because the gap between the lowest paid and the highest is multiples of very high pay. A business like, John Lewis would look unfavourable under that, because, it's a bigger business and actually employs people directly rather than outsourcing them. So you've got to make sure you're reflecting the kind of information that you want around there. But I think that, again, around things like recognition of trade unions, employee voice, that's what a good workplace is. That's what a good job is. And a good job can be in any sector if it's got those things. And I think about how best to communicate that, but I think there is a further area of work for us on it. And Andy's question on what I would call micro businesses, really. But look, yeah, it's a particular policy challenge, this, because obviously you've got people who are a major part of the economy. They're often people who are, they've gone into that line of business creation because they're in a certain part of the country where that's worked for them, or family-wise. So actually there's a real sort of equity around the country in getting it right for these people. They often have, first of all, a lot of kind of policy issues that are really more about self-employment and the tax system. It's a little bit difficult to deal with those from a business perspective. And also, to be honest, they're people who haven't got a lot of time to engage with politics and policy because of the nature of that business. I think things like, we've looked very much at things like the VAT threshold, but the arguments are around that, because obviously inflation has pushed up many more people to the VAT threshold. Again, the UK is already a bit of an outlier in how high that is, so there's no easy solution to do it. I like your suggestion of looking at things like the balance of kind of payment terms between platforms and the people on them, and kind of how, again, you could, I think the balance of power between those people is tricky, and the state could do a job in rectifying that. So it is very much on the agenda. In the small business plan we've published, there is reference to smaller businesses, because, again, what a lot of people think are small businesses are actually, micro businesses, and what they think of, an SME can actually be quite large in terms of often the conversation you have in the media around it. So it is definitely a part of the platform, as well as the bigger stuff around things like industrial strategy and the green prosperity plan. They get a lot of attention. The business rate stuff is very much in this area, to be honest.
Thank you very much. We're almost out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to the other panelists and ask them to, if they could share some final thoughts just for a minute or so.
Thank you, Saskia. So my final thought, beyond we need a transition to net zero that's just and nature positive, is I'd just like to come back quickly on two of those questions that came up. So the lady at the back with the red jumper asked, is Section 172 of the 2006 Companies Act working? It's not. And the reason why it's not working is because the enforcement of the Companies Act in the UK is virtually non-existent. So if Johnny was to be the Secretary of State at the Business Department in the next Labour government, the Labour Party needs to look at enforcement, because if people think they can get away with not complying with the law, they will get away with it. There's another facet of this which relates to corporate governance. In the UK, the Corporate Governance Code was written by Sir Adrian Cadbury in the early 1990s. It was groundbreaking at the time, and it introduced this concept called comply or explain. But the problem is, what happens when you don't comply? Because nobody holds you to account. So that's one of those ideas which was great in the 1990s. It may not be so hot in 2020. And on Fairer Workplace, just to take a slightly different slant on it, yesterday, I was at a major charities conference. There are 166,000 charities in the UK. They are big employers. There's millions of people work in the charity sector. Nearly all the trustees of charities are white, male, and of a certain age. And that's because to be a trustee, you invariably have to work pro bono. And the rest of society can't afford to work pro bono to make the important contribution that's needed. If you actually, as a charity, want to pay your trustees anything, you have to go and get permission from the Charity Commission to do that. Hey, that could change things at an instant. It could get more diversity of conversation around those boards. That's an example.
Thank you so much. And just before we're just going on to Davina as well.
Thank you. So just a couple of quick things. I think, in terms of company stakeholders and fiduciary duties, I think that is a really important point that Michael raised, in terms of enforcement, but actually also looking at other ways to encourage best practice and changing, the composition of boards, for example, employee boards, youth boards, particularly in bigger companies, I think could be, make a dramatic difference in terms of the outlook and the strategy of those businesses. I just wanted to finish off where I started off, which was that focus on government and business collaborating, and really encouraging a future Labour government to lean into business, to take them on the journey that they need to go to help us grow the economy.
Thank you, Davina. Jonathan, did you have anything else to add?
Just say, great conversation, great questions from the audience, I think, showing the breadth of the issues and the importance of all of this. And I would just again say, I hope everyone who is hoping to see a change of government when there's an election this year recognises this is not just the means to the revenue, of course, we all want to see for health services, for education, but actually integral to, will people be able to say this was an important moment in British history where the decline, the stagnation of the last decade and a half is turned around and materially benefits every part of the country. That's, I think, what we all want to see, and I think getting this right is absolutely central to that.
Thank you. And some very kind of important messages there around so much potential for good. But of course, we have a long way to go after 14 years of the Tories. Thank you so much for listening. You've been a great audience, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the day.